Hi, everyone. I'm Allie Katz. I'm the program coordinator at the Kelly Writers House, and welcome to this live stream of the launch of the Good Poem Project. The project comes from the mind of Amanda Silberling, one of this year's junior fellows, and I am extremely excited about this. The Good Poem Project poses the question, what is a good poem? What makes a good poem? I'm also incredibly excited about this lineup, some really amazing poets and poetry thinkers. I just want to also say that this is part of the Junior Fellows Award this year, supported by Creative Ventures, and it helps keep our recent Kelly Writers House alumni connected to the house and to Philadelphia and to the writing community. So this project really hits the nail right on the head. And I want to just give Amanda and all of our participants a round of virtual applause before they get started. So thank you, Amanda, for this, and thank you, everyone speaking tonight. This is applause. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to the virtual Writers House, and thanks to the non-virtual Writers House for supporting me with the Junior Fellows Prize and just in general supporting me for many years as a human being and writer. And I just wanted to quickly explain what the Good Poem Project is before we turn it over to our readers. I did try to write an intro, but then I babble a lot. So my way of preventing me from babbling is just reading the website description, which it's not a shortcut, it's a service. So in my public high school, every English student dreaded the poetry unit. And I was the weird girl who went to writing camp and liked poetry. And even I was like, learning poetry in a public high school the curriculum was very outdated and structured around like answering SAT questions quickly, which is not a great way to read poetry, is reading it during the SAT. But I felt like all of my fellow classmates, that was their way of learning about poetry. And they were like, I hate poetry. And I think sometimes people carry that with them after we are freed from having to take the SAT. People still kind of sometimes have this relationship where poetry feels accessible or like a puzzle that has to be like you have to answer the questions about it. And so these questions stuck with me about what makes a poem good and why I didn't enjoy the poetry unit in high school, but then I would go home and go on Tumblr and read all my friends on Tumblr's poetry. And then as I started submitting my own poems to journals and all that, and just trying to like get my poetry out there, I started wondering whether my work was good if it wasn't getting published or if it wasn't winning contests. And as a college student at Penn, for those of you familiar with Writers House, you know that Writers House loves experimental poetry. And I was like, wait, why am I more interested in learning more about flarf poetry than like a Shakespearean sonnet? And so I just got really invested in thinking through these questions of what makes a poem good. I know that this question is kind of unanswerable and maybe not even an important question to answer, but I think it's an important question to talk about. And I think that sometimes when we talk about what makes a poem good, we're talking both about our personal relationship with the poem, but also we're talking about how and why we assign literary value to things, what becomes part of the literary canon, what ethical code writers follow when they're writing, what the relationship is between the art and the artist, how socioeconomic privilege impacts who gets to read poetry and who feels like they have access to poetry. So, of course, I still don't know what makes a poem good, but I think for me, I found a lot more joy in my life as a poet through community and just through talking about poetry with people rather than through thinking about publication and contests, even though those things have their place. So with the Good Poem Project, I really just want to start a conversation. And in addition to this reading, the Good Poem Project is a website, goodpoemproject.com. And on that website, anybody, whether they're a poet, someone who hasn't read poetry since high school, anyone, you can submit what you think makes a poem good, and I'm aggregating and posting all of the responses. And on one hand, I just think it's kind of cool to see all the responses, but also I hope that asking people to think through poetry in a way that is hopefully accessible and hopefully sparks conversation will help create some sort of community. And yeah, so we have 7 readers tonight, and I asked them all to share a poem they think it's good. It might be one of their poems, it might not be, and then just kind of talk about it and think through the question of what makes a poem good. It's a pretty open-ended prompt, but I think that it'll be fun to see what everybody says. So I'm just going to go in alphabetical order by last name because sometimes you just got to keep it simple. So our first reader is Maya Arthur.
Hi. Hello. Thank you, Amanda, for inviting me and for letting me sort of agonize about what a good poem is. And a really good excuse to like put on makeup and some earrings and like feel like I'm at a reading, because we are. When Amanda asked me to be a part of this program and was generally telling me about the Good Poem Project, I kind of like freaked out. I was like, I don't know what a good poem is, or am I the authority for what a good poem is? Essentially, I was gaslighting myself because as a poet and a human being, I have every right to share my opinion and what speaks to me. And I feel like my feelings around poetry have changed so much in the past year, from initially pandemic distress of, all right, time to write my Ars Poetica, let's get this done, manuscript time, to there is really no point to poetry or even art at this point, to how must I survive? And forever, poetry has been the sustenance for myself. And I think for a lot of people, something that is welcoming. My favorite kind of poetry are ones that confuse you or are strangely vague or hard to comprehend. I love seeing moments of clarity in that fogginess or murkiness. It gives me a lot of pleasure because I feel like there is such honesty between the lines. And as someone who loves to overthink and overfixate, I find a vast array of meanings to the stanzas and the white space, how it literally looks like on the page or other material. I'm a big fan of eliminating logic. I find myself often not being able to comprehend my own feelings and thoughts, and I feel a sense of jaded connection to works that do the same. But alas, that is my favorite kind of poetry. I don't think that's necessarily what a good poem is, at least right now for me. Right now, I desperately want kinship and intimacy in these times, and I think a good poem, no matter how straightforward or logical or irrational and a big ol' mess, I want to feel kinship. I want to be held as a reader and a witness to the words of a piece, the web of relationships and musings and humanity. I feel like 2 poems that I've recently come across have really encompassed what I want and have been searching for. One is Erica Hunt's In the Corner of the Eye, and the other is my personal friend, Sanawani's Tomorrow is a Place. I do believe that I am forcing this to be in conversation with the other, these 2 poems, but I'm gonna go with it. I think they both show an equilibrium or an equal space between the reader and poet, a sense of memory or even humanity and how it can be contained. For Erica Hunt's piece, I think she eloquently and very intelligently connotes a very corny sentiment, which is so good that a slightly confusing piece could do that. Essentially, she's saying humans are very needy creatures. We need others. We are all the same at the end of the day. I kind of hate platitudes, so I love that this has what I need right now or what I need to like pump myself up, but it's also really fucking good and shows a she character that is all over the place, and it's okay. We are all the same at the end of the day. I'm definitely projecting, but I'm gonna go ahead and read it. So this is Erica Hunt's In the Corner of the Eye. She must be someone's missing person, the unread portion. She sits on the stoop tearing pages out of 18-month-old penthouse magazines that someone has stacked for recycling. The gray sky is an emulsion of humidity and promised rain. She's oblivious beneath her umbrella, eating French toast and a large orange juice that someone walked out without paying for. She is a victim of a conspiracy of her teeth that keeps her away from the food she loves: raw carrots, calm, apples, raisins. She is forced to order omelets and French toast. Sometimes she offers to sweep the floors, rinse the windows of their daily ashes, and to defer to the empty plate that poverty and the times demand. It depends. When it's busy, her strategies are good currency, the currency of goodwill. She's wearing a skirt and pants and it's cold, and she's between sexes just now. She's wearing shoes that don't fit her feet, like old felt hats at the ends of her legs. One of the definitions of being a person is that another person is talking to you. The person is particular, unlike that diffuse group of people you don't spend time with who are all pronouns. This person is the source of certain facts, but not the facts that she ever speaks out loud. This person you become accustomed to, her buckle, our buckle, her pens, our pens, her ankles, our ankles, her limp, our limp. Your person or her person, it doesn't matter across the line of the middle ground. Yeah, I love it. And I feel like the other piece I'm going to read, Sana's piece, shares the same theme as Erica, that we are all the same at the end of the day, and we can return to each other. We can hold space for each other. Big disclaimer about Sana's piece, it is written for me, which is slightly obnoxious of me to want to read it, but we're gonna go with it. Sana wrote it after we met in New York one day, and we hadn't seen each other in 5 years since freshman year of college. We met up for coffee, a walk, bookshop browsing, some really good Chinese food. It really showed how much time had passed in regards to our beliefs, our priorities, our locations, and yet time really hadn't changed at all. Our kinship was still very strong, perhaps even stronger. And I really, really love people, and I miss them so much. And I love the ebb and flow of relationships and friendships. I love knowing that I could always return to someone and vice versa, and we can share small pleasures and moments together. It's very idealistic thinking, and I know there are reasons to not engage with people or times we need to allow like folks a permanent exit from your life. But I won't lie, I love so many people that have entered my life, even the ones I do not like. I feel like my door always has a slight crack. And this poem really means so much to me, and I cry often to this poem, and just the fact that someone is seeing me. I think that's what a good poem is right now for me: being seen, being heard, a reassurance and validation, perhaps a communion in a way. That's what I want. So I'm going to read this as my final poem and the end of my soapbox manifesto of good poetry. Tomorrow is a Place by Sanawani. For Maya. We meet at a coffee shop. So much time has passed, and who is time? Who is waiting by the windowsill? We make plans to go to a museum, but we go to a bookshop instead. We're leaning in, learning how to talk to each other again. I say, I'm obsessed with my grief, and she says, I'm always in mourning. She laughs, and it's an extension of her body. She laughs, and it moves the whole room. I say, my home is an extension of my body, and she says, most days are better with a long walk. The world moves without us, so we tend to a garden, a graveyard, a pot on the windowsill. Death is a comfort because it says, transform, but don't hurry. There is a tenderness to growing older, and we are listening for it. Steadier ways to move through the world, and we are learning them. A way to touch your own body, a touch that says, dig deeper. There in the ground, there is our memory. I'm near enough my roots. Time is my friend. Tomorrow is a place we are together. And yeah, before I cry, I'm gonna end. And yeah, I think that's a good poem. And I think kinship right now is good poetry.
Thanks so much, Maya. That was great. And now we're going to turn it over to Amani Davis.
Hey. So yeah, I also had like a what's a good poem when like reached out to for this. But my only answer that I kept returning to was if it's good, I feel it feels good, and I know it because I feel it in my body. And I wrote a little thing reflecting on where that kind of measure of goodness in the poem came from. So this is a mini reflection on the somatic tradition of youth performance poetry. I've never been able to sit still during poetry readings. Try as I might to rein in my body's restless participation during very serious literary events with suits and ties and champagne, I find that I can only listen well when I allow myself to attend fully. Quickened applause, foot taps, and awestruck hums of appreciation included. This practice of embodied listening grew, I think, from where my training first began, the incredibly somatic realm of youth spoken word performance, organized poetry slam. Here, I learned to recognize a poem as effective when it happened both to and with its listeners, garnering active participation that formally extended. Also, wait, this is my first time reading in my own prose ever to an audience of people. So this is, I'm like, anyway. Here, I learned to recognize a poem as effective when it happened both to and with its audience, garnering active participation that formally extended past the figurative and into the somatic. During any given open mic, slam, or showcase, we convened under the agreed upon premise that the poetry we shared could engender a communal fellowship primarily received and recognized through the medium of the body. When a line, bar, or poem was good, like it just felt good. And the form of spoken word dictated that you translated that through movement. As a teenager raised under strict Christian instructions to ignore my body until absolutely necessary, this was one of the first exercises I had to test out my clumsy sense of beauty and pleasure. It wasn't true everywhere yet, but at those youth showcases, I could practice allowing my feelings to take the lead and lead me to what I knew might be good. Good poems called the applause, stomp, hum, run around the room, etc., out of me, unexpected as it might have been. And each time it taught me something about what kinds of things can move me and broaden my understanding of what could actually move me. And one thing I love about this form of somatic recognition of quality in a poem is that it allows for the listener to actively mark that there is a there, right at the exact moment of the poem's affect. From what I've lived through since awkwardly entering my first youth showcase at 13 years old, whatever good poetry is, it asks us to attend to goodness. This is not an inherently revolutionary accomplishment. Poetry alone does not shift the conditions of the material world, and the stakes are too high to pretend otherwise. I believe, rather, that when one is moved by poetry, that one might choose to remain in motion, to continue to cultivate goodness, beauty, and justice in one's own life long after the show ends. I used to shrug off the promise of countless slam MCs that the audience wouldn't leave out of here the same way they came in. But these days, I don't know, it's feeling a lot closer to true. And I'm gonna close with Kimon Felix's Yes, It Is Possible, because it is one of the poems I believe that attends, that I like love the most, that it attends to the body so fully. And knowing that Kimon came out of the spoken word tradition, the slam tradition, and yeah, just meaningful and timely. Fire book. Yes, it is possible. For most of my life, I remained unaware of this, the way a wingless arm is unaware of the conceit of flight. But now I know that yes, it is possible to be allergic to a person. It is possible for the body to be wholly autonomous in how it chooses to preserve itself, no matter what fleshy, amorphous image of the heart the synapse might conjure. A great fire muted by holy water, a blue room with one pink knob. No matter what you think you want, it's the body that decides and will reject whatever antibodies revile its stasis. And in this case, the foreign cell was the Pisces fish, a twin fish, a two-fish flush, unvirtuous and writhing in deceit and steeped in the drama of belonging to too many lies. And yes, I had prayed that he'd finally come back to me, and that when he'd knock, he'd appear with one less life. But then he did appear, a xenophile on a tour of homes. And that would be our last encounter. And that's my dryer. And that would be our last encounter. All I could do was heave at the sight of him, head oscillating dizzily between two different men, two different lives, so Piscean in his world of Elysian highs, but this time my systems nosed down, anatomy buckling out into autopilot, bringing me down to my knees to purge, and it was like this for days. I couldn't stomach a morsel, my receptors stunted with the shock of an imminent shift. I wept and cocooned myself into a sweat until, at once, it stopped. And I awoke to find myself at the kitchen table, perfectly unbothered, fingering cubes of fresh, wet aloe into my mouth, as if life itself were some benign victory I'd won. Thank you. So excited to be an audience member for the rest of this.
Yay, thank you, Amani. And our next reader is Izzy Lopez.
That's me. Yeah, well, like I'm sure others have said, and I'm sure will be echoed, this is a really exciting project. Amanda told me about this a while back when it got started. I remember filling out the what is a good poem to me for her website, which we should all do. Send Amanda your ideas on good poetry to put up on the site while I was at work at a museum job selling tickets. So I was on the job talking about poems instead, because that's what you should do when you're employed to do something else. And yeah, I agree that what is a good poem? Who am I to say? But really, this prompt made me think about how do I interact with poetry, especially as someone who doesn't really consider herself a poet. I write a lot of memoir. I think I have some snappy lines, but in terms of a body of poetry in a portfolio, no, I don't really have it yet. But it made me think that I interact with poems a lot like music, a lot like, your favorite albums that if we still were doing CDs, though I guess they're coming back, that you'd have like on the bedside table. For me, it's really like this comfort that you can play on repeat. Maybe I just like angsty things. I'm not sure. I'm sure my Spotify history of Avril Lavigne's Complicated would tell you something about who I am and what I'm working with. But here are some thoughts on good poetry, which in my contrarian way is largely about what's not good poetry, in my opinion, and then little bits of things I like, because I think one of the best ways to show people who I am, what I value, is just this like collage of all of these disparate things that I like, and they kind of sum together who I think I am. So here's some words. In the English classrooms of my central Massachusetts hometown, it seemed that there were two kinds of poetry: Shakespeare and Tumblr. Poetry was a lyric, romantic, lush way of telling a story of great human emotion. It was either incomprehensible due to verbose language, or too much too soon due to intense teenage angst. Neither interests me very much, though that is somewhat a lie, for I dabbled in Tumblr poetry only because I had some very good metaphors about my 8th grade boyfriend and band camp. I have never seriously considered myself a poet, but when I came to pen, like many others, I took the fated course English 88, for those in the know, modern contemporary American poetry. And the truth is, this class alone did not make me a poetry convert. I still feel that some poetry is unnecessarily obscure, but it did teach me that poetry can be a narrative space that embraces uncertainty. This course often referenced Amiri Baraka's incident, in which Baraka, when recounting a scene of intense police violence, says, "We have no word." I liked that, having no word. It felt true to life, for there were many moments where I couldn't put the right words together or in the right order to describe what I felt or what had happened. But I knew the truth of the experience, the echo of it, as I struggled to express it. To me, a good poem is any lovely arrangement of words that speaks to something you have struggled to articulate in other forums. I know a good poem when I read one, not because it definitely reinvents an ancient structure, and not because it secures a victory in using big words bingo. I know a good poem because it stops me, catches me, and holds me a little longer than I anticipated. My favorite poems revolve around daily experience, the simple and silly lives we all live, no matter what we write on our LinkedIn. I think about Bernadette Mayer's Failure in Infinitives, where she says, "To wash all the dishes only takes 10 minutes." Sandra Cicernos's One Last Poem for Richard, where she states, plain and true, "I loved your crooked sleep and never dreamed afraid." Nikki Giovanni's Mothers, as she proclaims, "We must learn to bear the pleasures as we have borne the pains." And of course, Mary Oliver's Roses, where she asks, what happens when the curtain goes down and nothing stops it? Not kissing, not going to the mall, not the Super Bowl. I suppose I am more interested in the poetic than poems themselves, and perhaps I'm splitting hairs. All I know is a good poem can soothe, as Ashbery says, the secret smudge in the back of your soul. I am curious about that smudge. I wonder what she has to say. And one of those poems that I just keep, if I could print it out in my back pocket and show to people as quickly as I can, is this poem, When You Have Forgotten Sunday, The Love Story by Gwendolyn Brooks, none other. And when you have forgotten the bright bedclothes on a Wednesday and a Saturday, and most especially when you have forgotten Sunday, when you have forgotten Sunday halves in bed, or me sitting on the front room radiator in the limping afternoon, looking off down the long street to nowhere, hugged by my plain old wrapper of no expectation and nothing I have to do, and I'm happy why, and if Monday never had to come. When you have forgotten that, I say, and how you swore if someone beeped the bell, and how my heart played hopscotch if the telephone rang, and how we went into Sunday dinner, that is to say, went across the front room floor to the ink-spotted table in the southwest corner, to Sunday dinner, which was always chicken and noodles, or chicken and rice, and salad and rye bread and tea, and chocolate chip cookies. I say, when you have forgotten that, when you have forgotten my little presentiment that the war would be over before they got to you, and how we finally undressed and whipped out the light and flowed into bed and lay loose-limbed for a moment in the weekend, bright bedclothes, then gently folded into each other. When you have, I say, forgotten all that, then you may tell, then I may believe you have forgotten me well.
Thank you, Izzy. And next up is Dan McKeon.
Hello, am I on right? I thought I hit stop video by accident.
You're good.
Okay, cool. 1 second while I drag windows around on my screen. Okay, hello. I am Dan. I guess I started as a poet because I reckon myself a fiction writer in freshman year of college, which is the time where no one should think they know themselves. And I got into writing poetry because I had to as part of the creative writing class. And I ended up liking writing poetry a lot more because I didn't have the focus to write fiction. So any plot holes, it could be like, it's a metaphor. And eventually I actually started doing metaphors and, anyway, a couple, 6 or 7 years went by and here I am now telling you what a good poem is. So I run a pretty cool poetry thing, which it's like a lit mag. It's trying to do sort of digital interactive stuff with poetry. So I'm very interested in exploring what that's like. Amanda's also the managing editor, so it's kind of, it's a little corrupt that I'm here. I'm just kidding. Maybe it's corrupt, who's to say? But yeah, so I wrote, I did my essay about kind of more about the structures of poetry, like where the structures around a poem versus the poem itself, I guess, and kind of like the world we build around a poem and the sort of interactivity a reader can have with poetry. So I'm gonna start with reading the poem that I won't give any information about because that sounds like a fun way to do stuff. And then I'll get into the essay. So. In the year Granddad died, we had the worst flood since 1998. Greg got trapped on top of a doghouse. The power was out for 2 days. Casey Hartley came by in his dad's boat, and I laughed when I saw him. Granddad left me an apple crate of books. He loved ghost stories and quoted them to himself in the hospital bed. In their wings, in their trees, all things die, be at peace. On his last day, he sat up suddenly and stared bug-eyed through the window at the old parking lots, wide and sparkling like oceans. He turned to my dad, eyes still wide. This house is haunted, he said, and died. So before I get into the essay, I just wanted to come clean. I don't really read anything, which is weird because as I just mentioned, I'm the editor of a lit mag. I was like the copy chief of my student newspaper. I graduated with a degree in English. I've published several poems and a couple chapbooks and such. And I don't read because I try to read, and then a lot of times I'll try to be reading like fiction, or if I read like really good poetry or something, I'll get like, let's say it's like a 300-page book, I'll get 30 pages in and be like, that's so good, I want to write now. And then I go and write, and then I don't read the book, and then I move on with my life. It's called ADHD, and it's powerful. So now that I got that out of the way, let me get into the essay. Also, I just found out who Orpheus is. Like, I don't know anything about Greek myths. I just found out about Orpheus. And if I were Orpheus, I would have simply not looked back. All right, let me get to the essay. I just had to dunk on Orpheus real quick. It's a dummy. All right. Out of the trinary of literature, I should back up. A lot of the words I use, when I was reading it over before this, I don't know if they're used correctly, so it's cool. Out of the trinary of literature, poetry, fiction, and nonfiction, poetry is often the most mythologized and least read among non-writers. It's a constant problem literary magazines and poets run into, reaching the elusive section of the population known as non-poets. Smarter folks than I who actually read things can better go into why that is. And I, as the representative of the not readers of the world, believe a good poem is one that can breach that gap. A good poem is one that goes to the reader instead of having the reader come to it. And I think a good poem builds something around the reader without the reader even noticing. So the poem I've chosen, the poem I read before, is from the video game Night in the Woods, a game where a cat drops out of college, moves back to her Rust Belt hometown, and plays bass with her high school friends. There's two aspects here that make it a quintessential good poem for me, and that's the interactivity of the poem and its place within a larger work. So to start, I'm going to get into the interactivity. So this poem is the very first thing the player encounters in the game. It's like when you first start the game, it's literally the screen just starts with that. You don't know anything else. You're just starting with this. I lost my place. Okay, so what's most intriguing about it is that it can be several different poems. So the one I read is only one version of it. When the poem is printing out on the screen, it stops at 3 different points, and the player is presented with a choice for the next line. All in all, there's 10 different stanzas that can print out depending on the line chosen. You can't read the stanzas you don't pick unless you play the game again, and the choices you make have no bearing on how the game plays out. You're essentially just assembling a poem as you read it, and once it's built, that's it. It's a simple level of interactivity, but at a time when most poetry is being published online, I don't know if that's factually correct, but it feels like most poetry is being published online, it is a criminally underused aspect. A good poem should draw a reader in, should work with the reader to create the experience. Having the reader choose where the poem's going makes the relationship between the poet and the reader much more intimate and much more of a moment. The poem they've built is here and now, and if they come back to it later, they can build a different moment. Interactivity opens the poem to more intimacy, but when poems are used inside of or auxiliary to a bigger work, they can really pack a punch. This poem prepares a world for the player before they've so much as seen the protagonist. It sets the tone, the setting, some of the characters, their histories, and some expectations for what's to come. The gameplay of Night in the Woods mostly focuses on exploring the town of Possum Springs, which is roughly set in western Pennsylvania, kind of Rust Belt-y Pittsburgh area. It's filled with townies, dilapidated buildings, and a permanent air of mild dread. This poem could stand on its own as a snapshot of any real-world town, and it operates exactly that way in game. It brings the player into Possum Springs, and by meeting this poem in its own larger world, we can experience the game more informed of where it wants to meet us. This also works the other way around. In the game, the character Selmers writes poems and asks the player if they'd like to hear them. Her poems start off very basic and what some would call bad, but if the player keeps going to Selmers each day to hear more poetry, she eventually reads one at a poetry reading that is a huge leap in quality. So I want to do a quick pause on the essay. I did pull up 2 of her poems that she reads that I called bad, but as I'm reading them, they're kind of good in their own right. I'm not going to read the one I called good. That one's a spoiler. So, my heart is a dankness, but when I see you, I feel a thankness. When I feel a blueness, all I need is a you-ness. So that's the first one. And then the second one is, sometimes I like fruit snacks out by the train tracks, a juice box and headphones, I enter the juice zone. So I'm gonna move on. Okay, so the good poem she reads at a poetry reading. Also in the poetry reading, the main character says all public poetry readings should be illegal. Something to consider. Her poem laments the fallen town with anger at the rest of the world. The poem benefits from the structure it is living in. The interactivity of the game is what allows Selmers as a poet to grow and eventually gives the player a poem that they helped build. Again, this poem meets the reader through a much more intimate path than seeking out poetry through traditional means. So in essence, what makes a good poem? The world it lives in and the relationship with the reader. It's a give and take, scratch my back process that makes the poem stick, and what a result it is to have your words resonate with a stranger with the help of that stranger. And that is all I have to say.
Thank you, Dan. We love video game poetry. And next we have Erin Jinmay O'Malley.
Hello. So this, I guess the process of sort of like what I'll be sharing is a journey. Like everybody sort of mentioned, I'd been thinking about like what a good poem is for a really, really long time. And I was hoping that it would just come to me, but it never did. So I wrote this essay earlier today. And when I was also thinking about what I wanted to share, I was going to share a poem by one of the poets who I mentioned in this essay, but then I ended up writing a draft of this poem last week that I think really answers a lot of the questions that I have about good poems. And so I hope sharing this essay and reading this poem will, I guess, like like a lot of us are writers, but like from a perspective of like writing poetry, like asking that question of what it means to write a good poem or to read a good poem while like wanting to write one as well. So I'll start with the essay. When asked how long it took him to write his debut collection, Indecency, Justin Philip Reed responded, "In my body, my whole life. On paper, let's say 3 years. The draft of my poem that I'll be reading was written over a period of 3 days, but I, like Reed, have been holding it in my body for years. Growing up, I never aspired to anything other than the girlhood that I'd been named with, at least in part because the alternative scared me. I thought that to claim masculinity for myself would mean inheriting the violence I knew of men. Later, I would revise my relationship to men. I would understand that the verb desire could stand between us and mean something true. When I say I desire the bodies of men, I mean that I want to live in a world where I can walk in the dark without the fear of not making it to the next morning. All of my work, but this poem in particular, is the child of so many things. The patron saints of my writing are, to name a few, Ocean Vuong, Jericho Brown, Alex Dimitrov, and Hugh Min Nguyen. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the queer writers who've shaped my writing the most are gay men. They are, after all, the ones who possess the bodies I desire, who, even when faced with the cruelties of this world, write poems about loving or fucking these bodies. I've noticed that there's a kind of work within the genre of gay contemporary poetry that's practically canonical at this point. The poem where the speaker has sex with a stranger he's never met before in a semi-public place, maybe a park or a field. There aren't, to my knowledge, any sapphic poems like this, and I know why. It's simple. We can't meet up with faceless strangers from the internet because we want to live. In her poem, Wild Geese, Mary Oliver writes, "You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves." Mary Oliver describes falling in love at first sight with a woman who would become her partner for the rest of her life, saying, "I took one look at her and fell hook and tumble." There's almost nothing I find more beautiful than the kind of fierce devotion between these two women that they shared with each other. But these are the only sapphic poems I know of. I ask then, what if the soft animal of my body wants something outside the realm of love, something casual just to briefly ease the condition of having a body itself? Thus, my poem is a response to the Gay Sex in a Field poem, as well as the poems about sapphic love that Mary Oliver might be associated with. With this piece, I'm trying to have a conversation with poets whose work dwells in both of these houses, and more broadly, with these two symmetrical yet wildly different communities. For me, this is a good poem because it names a violence without enacting it. It articulates something I've always thought, but have never known how to say, perhaps because there is no other way for me to say it. I believe that even when a good poem reaches its final line, it has no end. A good poem comes when the self has listened for so long that it must finally speak. And when that time comes, it is never quiet again. So this is my poem. The title is Mary Oliver, Does Everything Have to Be About Love? Mary Oliver, does everything have to be about love? Don't tell me I'm alone in my desire to have anonymous sex with people who look almost exactly like me. I find it hard to believe you've never looked at a hot stranger and imagined your body on top of your body with their face without also imagining marrying them. All I'm saying is that if enough women wanted me for my body, I'd want it too. Isn't that why men love their bodies with their bodies? I bet it feels good to be in a park fucking a man while being seen by another, one who could hurt you both, but instead closes his eyes as if shutting a closet door, stands there in that unused dark before walking away. I think men are stupid, but I'm still afraid of what they do because it's me it'll happen to. Take, for instance, the distance between any two men, which is always a field they can return to, but never really leave. I could go there, but I'd never come back. You know this, though. So what if the heart wants what it wants? The body just wants to live, and you, like the field, wait so deeply you long. Thank you.
Thank you, Erin. And now it is time for Mingo Reynolds to take the virtual stage.
Hi, everybody. So I was asked by Amanda to do this, and I love Amanda, and I was intrigued, but I don't identify as a poet or even really as a writer. I'm just surrounded by writers. And so when she asked me, I was a little confused. But now that I'm seeing the program, I'm realizing that Amanda knows stuff. And maybe my perspective will resonate in some way that someone who doesn't have the confidence in their own writing can still really embrace a good poem. So about 5 years ago, I decided to take advanced poetry writing at Penn. And I was pretty terrified, but I had been working with the professor who taught it for several years, and he was threatening to retire. And I'd heard it was the best class that so many people had ever taken that I decided to take the plunge, even though I was no poet. So working in the Center for Programs in Contemporary Writing at Penn has always put me in uncomfortably close proximity to poetry. My approach to it before the workshop was to try to be invisible during close readings so I wouldn't get called on, and to nod whenever anyone said the word meta. Sorry, my scroll isn't working so well. In Greg Janikian's shop, we read a collection of poems and wrote one of our own each week. We also had to memorize and recite a certain number of lines of poetry during the semester. In this class, I was surrounded by students far less than half my age, some of whom had been writing poetry for years. Imani. One week, a fellow student even brought in a copy of his recently published chat book. When I wrote my first poem in that class, it wasn't as hard to get words on paper as I expected it to be, but I was worried that was a fluke. And as the semester progressed, I was astonished to find that I actually like reading and writing poetry. I love hearing what it does for others and how different each reading can be. My experience with workshopping in that class revived my faith in humanity. Everyone brought kindness and their open mind to the table each week and were generous with their comments and critiques. I have found that I enjoy exercising my brain through writing poems. And tonight I'm going to share 2 good poems that I read and recited for that class. The first is "O Elegant Giant" by Laura Kazishki. And pardon me if I cry, I'm a sap. And Jehovah, and Alzheimer, and a diamond of extraordinary size on the hand of a starving child. The quiet mob in a vacant lot. My father asleep in a chair in a warm corridor. While his boat, the unsinkable, sits at the bottom of the ocean. While his boat, the unsinkable, waits marooned on the shore. While his boat, the unsinkable, sails on and sails on. The second poem I'm going to read is a small-sized mystery by Jane Hirschfield. Leave a door open long enough, a cat will enter. Leave food, it will stay. Soon, on cold nights, you'll be saying, "Excuse me," if you want to get out of your chair. But one thing you'll never hear from a cat is "excuse me," nor Einstein's famous theorem, nor the quality of mercy is not strained. In the dictionary of cat, mercy is missing. In this world where so much is missing, a cat fills only a cat-sized hole, yet your whole body turns toward it again and again because it is there. So oddly enough, I was actually friends with Laura Kosishki when we were in college. We both went to University of Michigan and we were resident advisors together. I subletted her apartment one summer, but I had lost touch with her until we read her collection of poems here at Penn. And I found that she wrote these poems when she was going through the loss of her father's to Alzheimer's. Unfortunately, I could relate because my mother was also slipping away. And so I actually got in contact with Laura. She's now a professor at our alma mater, and we've corresponded a bit since. And I even wrote a poem based on one of hers for my final portfolio. What makes me say this poem is good is the artful way she uses so few words to have such impact. Her poem is short, it isn't descriptive, but it paints a picture that shakes me to the core and makes me feel less alone in my grief. The other poem by Jane Hirschfield is good in a different way. And even though I love cats, this poem isn't about them. What I see here is love, loss, and loneliness. And I still struggle to read it without tearing up. How is it that this funny poem about cats can bring me to tears every time I read it? What they have in common for me is that something is revealed in each of these poems, something that I'm feeling, but I can't completely describe. And they don't describe it. They just reinforce that it is there and it is real. So while these poems fill only a poem-sized hole, I turn to them again and again.
Thank you so much, Mingo, both for that reading and also for confirming that there's a method to my madness, because I think that in conversations about poetry, we need people who don't consider themselves poets to be part of the conversation, because everybody should be able to talk about poetry. And thank you for proving that. And finally, we have Amy Saul Zerby here to close us out.
Hi, thank you so much. This has been incredible to listen to everyone, and I think it's such a good idea and such important work for us to talk about this question of what it means for a poem to be good. And I'm just excited to be a part of it. So I'm just gonna go ahead and read what I wrote, which is really ended up more like a speech than an essay, because I was like dictating it while I wrote it, and because I don't know how to write an essay anymore, it turns out. So I'm gonna read that. There was a moment after a reading I did a few years ago where I was having this conversation with a woman who'd been in the audience, and she was commenting on how personal the poems I'd read were. She said it was very brave of me to read them aloud like that. And at the end of the exchange, she said point blank, "I could never do what you do." It struck me because by that point, I had been doing this for years, reading intensely personal work in front of audiences. And I was so used to it that it didn't even occur to me that this is strange or that other people couldn't imagine doing it. And I thought, how did I get to this point where this feels so normal to me? And then of course, doubt creeps in and you think, is this even normal? Should I be doing this, etc. And then I thought about the time I spent agonizing over whether I should keep trying to find a publisher for my first manuscript, and how when you're in that space, there are so many alarms going off in your head saying, stop, don't do this. What if no one reads this and finds value in it? And in that moment, you have to make a deal with yourself. You say, I'm going to take this piece of writing that is deeply personal and make it public, despite everything inside me that is telling me not to do that. And I'm going to do it because I believe that it will be worth the risk. And obviously that means different things to different people. Everyone has their own reasons for writing and their own goals. For me, it always comes back to the relationship between the writer and the reader. I would love to sell lots of books and make a living that way, but if that was the most important thing to me, I would probably be learning to write for film or television, or writing a novel that could be easily adapted. Not that there's anything wrong with any of that, but I think what you have with people who continue to write poetry, knowing that it isn't as likely to open those doors to a large readership or financial success, is this deep love for and belief in the value of poetry. And I think that creates an interesting space in the poetry community. Because the genre is so niche, poets have to be especially determined to keep producing that kind of work. For a poem to be good, I think it has to have as much value as it can in order to be worth everything that is going against it. It doesn't have to be explicitly personal, but if it isn't honest, I don't think it's going to be as valuable, or that it's going to have the impact that it could otherwise. I think that the impact it has on its readers is really the only way to measure that value. So a good poem has to be a poem that finds the person who will benefit from reading it and offers them something of use. A good poem should make itself useful and of service to as many people as it can, or even just to one person, because if it can do that, then it was all worth it. That is my stab at an essay for the first time since college, which was a long time ago now. And then I'm gonna read just a poem from my first book, which did eventually get published, but which for a while I wanted to throw in the trash. But I'm glad I didn't. This is called Poem to Remind You of What You Have Maybe Forgotten. I am writing this poem for you, but it will not give you strength. It will not hold you in its arms or stroke your hair as a mother strokes her child's. And yet I am writing it for you. It is yours now. I leave it on your doorstep in a basket like an unwanted child. It will no longer wrap its tiny hand around my finger. I let go of this poem only because I know I can trust you to keep it close and give it your love. You know you have so much love to give, don't you? Maybe this poem will help you to know that you are not just capable of love, you are bursting with it. That's all I got. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy, and thanks again to all of our readers, Maya, Amani, Izzy, Dan, Aaron, and Mingo, and also Amy again. I said your name twice, it's fine. And yeah, so you can check out the Good Poem Project at goodpoemproject.com, where on the homepage there's a handy dandy Google form where you can like tell me what you think a good poem is. Even if you're like, why would you care what I think? I care what you think. I think everyone has a different answer to that question, and it's really exciting. So I hope to see responses there. We are on the social medias at Good Poem Project, and you can learn more about the readers. I believe in the YouTube description, there's everybody's bio and everything. You should follow them and buy their books if they have them and stuff, like Amy's book. And yeah, thank you so much for watching. And poetry is good sometimes. I don't know. We love poetry.